Now we have a distinguished speakers today and an important topic. The topic is about social selectivity and study flexibility. So it's about some important characteristics of study, higher education studies in Europe, and what is specific is one to be able to draw on important data from the Eurostudent project, and then to be able for the first time to combine this data with information on institutional characteristics from the European Higher Education Sector Observatory. And the presenter is Hendrik Schirmer, who is researcher at the German Center for Higher Education, Research and Science Studies. I think it should be about correct. And I will act as a discussant. So you know the usual rule. Hendrik will present. Please try to stay within 40 minutes. I will make comments and then we will open the floor. Please mute your micro when you are listening. We love you, hope you open your camera, because we love seeing faces of people smiling and trying to understand what the presenter is showing. You can ask questions directly by open camera and micro, or you can post in the chat, or you can raise the hands as usual. So with all this said, I want to thank Georg, Anne, and Rita for organizing this meeting, and give the floor to Hendrik for your presentation.
Hey, thank you, Benedetto. I hope I'm sharing my screen now.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Could you make it more? Okay, that's in full screen.
Is it working?
Yes, we see both the first, the current, and the next one.
This is not what I
wanted.
Let me see. Sorry.
It's the same as before.
The same. No. Now it's not working at all. Okay. I try again.
That's okay now.
Yeah, but
probably you cannot see us anymore, but
yeah, but the presentation isn't really running, is it?
We see the first slide.
Let me restart PowerPoint. Sorry. I did a tech check and went to the meeting before it started and everything worked. So let's try again.
Really? It's the same. Oh, okay, we stay in this way.
Yeah, okay, we'll do it this way. Sorry. Okay. So once again, thanks for the invitation, Benedetto, and also thanks for the nice introduction. My topic in today's presentation, as Benedetto already said, is social selectivity and study flexibility at different types of higher education institutions in countries of the European higher education area. Now, why is this topic relevant? The COVID-19 pandemic most certainly put a need for increased digitalization efforts in higher education and beyond on all of our agendas. The ministers responsible for higher education in Europe pointedly formulated their vision of a digitalized European higher education area in the Rome Communiqué of 2020, taking the potential as well as the shortcomings of remote teaching and learning into account, namely possibilities for increased inclusion of underrepresented student groups on the one hand, and challenges with regards to an inflexible over-reliance on digital formats for other student groups on the other hand. Now, 4 years later, when the COVID-19 pandemic is mostly over, ministers still have digitalization on their agenda, but consider it more as a hybrid option for the purpose of study flexibility. Actually, the discussion about flexible study modes like correspondence studies or part-time studies is much older. But the recent developments certainly pushed awareness about study flexibility as means to support social inclusion in higher education further. Today, I'm going to try to give answers to a number of questions related to issues of social selectivity in the context of study flexibility. I give a slight warning ahead. My findings are by no means comprehensive, and I can only present selective indications so far. But nevertheless, let's go through some questions that arise in the context of my research topic. Understanding the prevalence, demographics, and satisfaction levels associated with flexible study modes offers insight into the evolving landscape of higher education, particularly in the context of rapid technological advancements and global challenges such as the COVID-19 pandemic. By examining the commonality and interconnections of flexible study modes between and within countries, we can gain a deeper understanding of shifting paradigms in educational delivery and accessibility. Exploring the demographics of students engaging in flexible study modes allows for a more nuanced understanding of educational equity and inclusivity, shedding light on the diverse needs and preferences of learners across different educational contexts. Exploring various characteristics of higher education institutions offers valuable insights into the diversity and dynamics of educational landscapes. This includes different types of HEIs, such as universities and non-universities, and the level of private sector involvement, as well as education intensity, by which I mean the ratio of students per academic staff, PhD intensity as a proxy for institutional research activity, and subject concentration, which means the HEI's specialization in certain study subjects. While institutional diversity can enrich a higher education system in numerous ways, such diversity becomes problematic when it reproduces and perpetuates social inequalities. Access to certain types of HEIs may be made difficult for specific societal groups, thereby reproducing and institutionalizing social divides associated with obtaining a degree from, for example, a particularly research-intensive or a highly specialized institution. Of particular concern here are the prosperity within students' families, which, according to the European objectives for the social dimension of education, should not influence institutional choice, and the educational background, which is a categorization in which many inequalities in the endowment with economic, social, and cultural capital culminate. Understanding different HEI characteristics in the context of flexible modes of study sheds light on how these institutions create opportunities for flexible learning and cater to various student demographics. This understanding is essential for addressing questions about the differential access and opportunities among students across diverse institutional settings. Traditionally, it is assumed that physical contact among students and between students and that teachers promote social and academic skill development, and those contributes to study success. More recent research, however, has examined further the increasing importance of virtual forms of socialization, as well as alternative, for example, virtual teaching and learning formats, and explored their role in building social and academic networks or capital. However, a direct comparison of the relationship between flexible study formats on academic success on a broad empirical basis are still lacking. And again, I'm only going to scratch at the surface today as well. In order to shortly summarize my research questions and mention some underlying assumptions, I'll walk you through a small diagram, which is going to be enriched with some empirical findings over the course of my presentation. Diverse student characteristics with regard to economic necessities or familial responsibilities may necessitate using flexible study formats, namely part-time, correspondence, or online studies, in order to get all these responsibilities under one roof. We can further assume that students' social background has an impact when it comes to the choice of higher education institution, partly due to economic considerations, but also due to the motivation for studying or the specific study goal. Higher education institutions, with their varying foci and conditions, can be expected to offer a differing range of study models due to their specific and diverse character. And finally, study modes may affect study outcomes, meaning success in the form of student satisfaction or good grades or a low dropout intention, etc. But before I start with the actual findings, I would like to tell you a bit about the data sources and in the process do a little self-promotion, so to say, for the Eurostudent project as well. In the Eurostudent project, we aim at providing a broad, policy-relevant cross-country comparison of data on the social and economic conditions of student life in Europe, assisting participating countries in capacity building to establish policy-relevant and robust national monitoring structures for the social dimension of higher education, and supporting countries in their efforts to use the insights from the international comparison to review and improve the social dimension of higher education in their country. As you can see in the globe on the left hand, we covered a large geographic variety of countries all over the European higher education area in our 8th project round. And as you can see in the figure on the right hand, our survey includes indicators from all stations in the student life cycle, which makes Eurostudent 8 an appropriate source of information for questions about students' background, students' study surroundings, as well as their study success prospects. However, until the 8th round of the project, we had a lack of information about students' higher education institution. In order to explore possibilities to fill this information gap, we cooperated with the research team of the European Tertiary Education Register, or ETA in short. The European Tertiary Education Register is a database covering higher education institutions across 41 European countries, providing detailed data on areas like student demographics, staffing, finances, and graduate outputs. For the Eurostudent project, select ETA indicators from 2020, or in some cases 2019, in case more current data wasn't available, were integrated to explore synergies between both projects. 4 key indicators are going to be considered in my presentation today. First, the institutional control, which differentiates public and private higher education institutions. Also, I'm going to take into account the education intensity, which basically is the number of students per academic staff, as well as the PhD intensity, which gives the number of PhD students per total students of an institution. And finally, the subject concentration, which is a diversity index based on the distribution of students across different study subjects. After this more methodological side note, we can delve into the findings finally. Let's first take a look at the prevalence of 3 types of flexible study modes throughout Europe. First off is the formal or the legal status of students. At least a third of students in Poland and Malta have an official part-time study status, while such an official part-time solution is not offered in countries such as Austria, Denmark, and Georgia. Other kinds of official regulations regarding time commitment exist in relevant proportions only in Latvia, Lithuania, the Netherlands, and Romania. In Georgia and Iceland, distance learning is very prevalent, with over a third and just under a quarter of students respectively studying in this mode. Whereas the possibility of distance learning is not available in Azerbaijan, the Czech Republic, Croatia, or Hungary. While about half of students in Finland, Latvia, and Iceland predominantly or entirely attend their courses online, the proportion in Croatia, France, the Czech Republic, Denmark, Austria, and Portugal is less than 10%. As you can already see, it's quite difficult to keep track of all these country variations. The correlation matrix shown in this table analyzes whether the 3 mentioned forms of flexible studying go hand in hand within countries and establishes a connection to the study intensity. Most relationships are not significant, indicating the diversity and variation between national higher education systems regarding their study statuses and modes. In most cases, one characteristic does not coincide with another. Specifically, low study intensity is not correlated with the aggregated part-time and other statuses or distance learning, which shows that student populations are creating their own flexibility in case the higher education system lacks a formal way to provide it. However, online and distance learning are moderately and significantly correlated. And finally, low study intensity, mainly with regard to taught studies, is more common in higher education systems where broader shares of the student population are studying mostly or completely online. After this rough overview, we can now turn back to the assumed mechanisms I presented at the beginning of my presentation. We know that national higher education systems differ considerably in terms of the prevalence and the extent of study flexibility. However, it remains to be seen whether common trends exist regarding the user groups of these flexible study forms. So who actually are the students making use of the opportunities of part-time, distance, and online studies? And in fact, despite all national differences regarding the range of offerings, common trends can be observed concerning a variety of student characteristics. On the one hand, the higher the age group, the more likely it is that part-time distance or online studies are embraced. Students without a tertiary educational background more frequently utilize these three forms of flexible studying on average across countries. Also, students whose income relies heavily, which means more than 50% on earnings from own employment, make use of the opportunities of flexible studying much more often than students whose income stems mostly from family sources or public student support. The higher the study intensity, which means the time spent on lectures and personal studies, the less likely is a flexible study mode adopted. Also, students who have a transition period of more than 2 years between leaving the school system and entering higher education more frequently opt for part-time distance or online studies than students with a relatively direct transition path from school into higher education. And this finding is also reflected in terms of the access route. Students with alternative pathways to higher education are disproportionately engaged in part-time distance or online studies. The trends shown and described here can be observed in all countries with very few exceptions and to only slightly varying degrees. One point is one has to keep in mind when looking at these numbers is that there's considerable correlation between these student characteristics, meaning that, for example, the dependency on self-earned income often goes hand in hand with decreased study intensity, or students from non-academic families, it's without tertiary education background, more commonly enter higher education later in life and use non-traditional access routes. When it comes to the relationship between students' social background, we observe some clear patterns across countries. Universities, which are typically institutions with the right to award doctoral degrees, have a higher proportion of students who rate their parents to be well off or very well off, as well as students with tertiary educated parental backgrounds. Higher education institutions with a high or very high balance between students and academic staff at HEIs consist of higher proportions of students from affluent background and with tertiary education background compared to institutions with lower staffing levels. The more research-intensive higher education institution, as approximated here by doctoral student enrollment, the higher proportion of students from well-off and tertiary educated parental backgrounds. A marked difference in social composition is, however, not initially evident regarding the differentiation of different types of HEIs based on their field specialization or subject concentration. Interestingly, also the differentiation of social composition between public and private HEIs that does not yield differences, whereas the differentiation of educational background by institutional control does indeed suggest that a higher proportion of students from tertiary educated parental backgrounds study at public HEIs. Now, what may be the underlying mechanism between this finding, even though we know that parental financial status and educational background are so highly correlated? On the one hand, the cross-country averages depicted in the figures at hand provide only a rough and necessarily abbreviated overview. National specifics, which certainly exist, are those leveled out in the figures here. At the same time, despite the strong relationship between parental financial status and educational background, it should not be assumed lightly that there is a simple match between both characteristics. Differences based on educational background are not only an expression of economic disparities between students' parental homes, but also encompass the entire interplay of social and cultural resources that shape educational decisions. After analyzing the prevalence of flexible study modes and their utilization by specific student groups on the one hand, and the social selectivity of certain types of institutions on the other hand, the question arises regarding the interconnection of study modes and institutional characteristics. Regarding formal status of enrollment, learning modalities and delivery mode, they are often parallel and mostly very clear differences between types of institutions. We see that non-universities appear as providers of part-time, distance, and online study formats to considerably higher degree than universities. Further on, while public higher education institutions more frequently offer part-time studies than private ones, they lag behind in terms of distance and online formats. Also, the larger the imbalance between students and academic staff at HEIs, the more likely its students are engaged in part-time, distance, or online study formats. Further on, the higher the research intensity of institutions, here operationalized as PhD intensity, the lower the proportion of part-time, distance, or online study formats among their students. And finally, the more specialized an HEI is in certain fields of study, the higher the proportion of part-time, distance, or online study formats. Just to give you a short impression about the extent of these differences I just described, I'm showing you the cross-country averages for the provision of digital study formats at different types of higher education institutions. I've got the complementary figures for part-time studies as well as distance studies at hand as well, but didn't want to bore you too much at this point, at least. Another reason why I decided to show you the specifics of digital study modes in relation to institutional characteristics relates to the next and final step in my thought process, which takes study success characteristics into account, and in which I also go back to more specific country information after all these cross-country averages. Overall, students across all countries express a moderate degree of knowing fellow students with whom to discuss subject-related questions, with mean values ranging from 3.0 to 3.9 on this 5-point Likert scale. Notably, in all countries except Lithuania and Romania, there are significant differences among students in various teaching modes, indicating that predominantly online learners tend to have considerably lower integration compared to their peers in balanced or in-person modes, as you can see in the blue dots positioned below the average in almost all countries. This finding, namely that online learning disrupts peer integration across countries, should give rise to doubts about the suitability of the current use of digital media formats for learning cooperative and collaborative skills that are extremely relevant later on in professional life. However, there are diverse interactions between teaching modes and student-lecturer relationships, which can only roughly be described in the context at hand. While online students in several countries, namely Georgia, Hungary, Malta, Poland, and Romania, rate their lecturer skills superior to their peers in balanced or in-person modes. There's also a group of countries in which online students rate their lecturer skills below their peers in more traditional modes of studies, namely Finland and the Netherlands, as well as Croatia, Denmark, and Estonia to a lesser degree. This could be an indication that there is potential for optimization in terms of online teaching quality, at least in these countries. Finally, the data on students' intention to abandon higher education reveals varying degrees of dropout intention across countries, with mean values ranging from 1.1 to 1.9. In countries like Slovakia, Poland, Iceland, Lithuania, Malta, Estonia, Finland, and Azerbaijan, there are only minor or insignificant differences in dropout intention among students in different teaching modes, suggesting a consistent trend throughout the respective student populations, regardless of the mode of study. On the contrary, countries such as Georgia, the Czech Republic, Croatia, Norway, Hungary, Austria, Denmark, Portugal, the Netherlands, or Romania exhibit significant variations, indicating a more complex relationship between dropout intention and the challenges posed by online learning. Now, to wrap up my presentation, let me say that the analyses presented so far have some methodological limitations, as they only present descriptive findings based on bivariate variable combinations. The way ahead most certainly is to calculate a comprehensive statistical model that relates all these factors against each other in a multivariate setting, takes into account the different levels we are looking at, namely individual students on the one hand and higher education institutions on the other hand, and further on identifies the salient factors in my path diagram that I use to walk you through my analyses. However, there are some important points already to keep in mind. We can observe a strong variation in and varying focus on flexible study modes between countries. Further on, increased age, non-academic background, economic reliance on own earnings, low study intensity, and non-traditional higher education entry relate to students' increased demand for flexible study modes. Students' choice of higher education institutions is socially selective, as we have seen on some of the characteristics. Universities, private institutions, institutions with a more favorable student-to-teacher ratio and increased research intensity tend to be the more exclusive institutions. The degree of provision of flexible study modes varies between types of HEI, with non-universities, institutions with a more unfavorable student-teacher ratio, a decreased research intensity, and more field-specialized HEIs, more engaged in flexible study modes, while we observe diversity with regard to the public or private institution characteristic. And finally, flexible study modes, which are here exemplified through digital studies, relate to study success prospects across countries when it comes to peer interruption, but with varying findings when it comes to the lecture quality or the dropout intention. And with these words, I'm at the end of my presentation. I thank you a lot for your attention, and I'm looking forward to any questions or comments.
So thank you so much, Hendrik. Could you stop sharing your screen?
Yes, sure. Sorry about the difficulties about sharing.
No problem.
Don't know what happened there.
So I have to act in my role as discussant and to find all possible weak points in your work, of course. No, I want to say first that the topic is really important. And it comes along an idea we developed in the last 2 decades that we need to look within higher education. As I used to say, in the past, the problem was to have young people going to higher education. And the big division was that those in higher education, those outside higher education, because we lived in an elite system. Now in a mass system, almost 60 to 80% of an age class goes to some form of higher education, but we start discovering that differentiation occurs within higher education, and also social selection occurs within higher education. And of course, this has to do with changes in the labor market. Before an higher education, a university degree was a label of quality. Now employers start to look which university you come from, your grades, etc. So it's very important to understand what happens within higher education, and that's really a direction we are going. And really, it shows the value of interconnecting data sources. We have now good data on heterogeneity of higher education, and this can be matched with other data, as in your case, on study mode, on social condition, etc. So I think that's the baseline. It's really a fundamental area. And as we discussed before the seminar, we discussed how to improve within the European Higher Education Sector Observatory the interoperability between these sources. Now, my questions or critiques, and then maybe some useful suggestions to go forward. My first comment is that maybe you are putting too much in the box. So it's very honorable to think of a structural equation model, multivariate model with all dimension, etc. But when you are pragmatic and you know that the data, we don't have billions of data points, there may be too much in terms of topics. For example, I do think the topic of social selectivity within higher education is a topic per se, which would which would have its own analysis also, because I'll come later. There is a lot of nuances in there which need to be deepening. And also something maybe important is to distinguish between what we already more or less know and what is new. I mean, the fact that there is part-time education, and this is mostly non-university sector with all the student working, etc., seems to me not very new. It's something, it's a trend we know and has been studied by the literature on professional higher education, for example. So the question is, what is new, what we discover as new pattern. And I think, for example, the discussion of digitalization is interesting for me in that respect. And something which might be a good starting point is clear, as far as I can judge your results, relationship between digitalization and part-time education. So what you get as a baseline picture, maybe it's too hypothetical, but what I get is digital is changing mostly higher education at the border. So for part-time, etc., where of course instead of having students coming the weekend, you offer them online lecture, but seems to be changing less, at least in the data you have, the traditional core of higher education. But it's a question to you whether this is correct. And this comes also to a question I had. I'm a methodologist, about quality of data, because some of the correlation you showed are very suspect. So when you ask about mostly completely online and distance learning, and the correlation is significant but is relatively low, I'm starting to ask whether the data is so robust. because you would expect these coincide, for example, largely. So I think I would have questions about the methodological robustness of, well, not because of your fault, but because these are difficult things to measure in terms of. And also the related question is author form of study flexibility, because the real big question is what is changing in regular higher education. And there is little evidence that the question is are things not changing really, which might be. If I take my university, I would say not much change in student delivery modes education, or things are more subtle. Now, something I have to warn, especially when you do the work, for example, on social selectivity, is about the interaction between country and characteristics. So when you compare public and private institutions or university and non-universities, the role of these kind of sectors is different by country, but this correlates with social characteristics, because the students might be, the educational background as a systematic variation by country. So you risk seeing differences by type of institution, which are the outcome of differences between countries. So
which is why I really think a structural equation model or something like that is necessary.
Let me try to finish and then I give you back the word.
Yeah.
Which you would suggest that for this type of analysis, for example, simply multi-level models would be at place. And but for example, there also there is, I would suggest to explore more what is significant and non-significant. For example, in the slide about parental financial status and educational background by types, there is one clear signal is research intensity. The authors are, you can discuss whether they are significant or not, but the big trend is that, which is an important finding.
Sure.
It's not specialized or non-specialized, it's not public or private, which differs, but the variable on PhDs is more comparable, and you get that in research universities are populated by better students from better backgrounds. So I think this focus could be useful. I would also suggest, and maybe you could comment, thinking on flexibility in terms of dimensions, which may be a broader framework where you use also some of the data, because flexibility is in geography. You can study at different places. In time, you can study over the weekend, or you have the classical semester model and the delivery mode. And it's an interesting question for me how these combine. Maybe in your student, you have some combinations. And my last point is about the outcome, not the outcome, but the driving mechanism. Because one thing is, of course, that the outcome might vary depending on the type of delivery. But I might suggest to test whether there are reputational effects. So if I say I had a diploma in Oxford, but I stay online from Lugano, it's one thing. I had 1 year in Oxford. It's 1 year in Oxford. So I think this mechanism which might drive student choices, and what you suspect from the literature in the US, you know, there is little evidence that students learn more in better universities in a way. But for sure, they get more value on the labor market. So it's, I think, investigating this driving mechanism, which might explain why the core of higher education seems to be so stable. Might be about quality of learning, but might be also quality of, so just having the label. So these are some comments and questions, and I give you back the word for.
Thank you, Benedetto. That was quite a lot. I don't think, I'm not sure if I got everything right, but
I'll send you just my list of points.
A broader reply would be that all of your methodological points are really valuable. I see them as well. And it's, yeah, it really is with all of these factors that I took into account, it's really quite difficult to arrive at a point where you, on the one hand, get a yeah, detailed enough picture, while at the other hand, having yeah, the more suitable detailed information as well. And this actually is why I suggested in the end that more sophisticated models would be necessary to really get behind all the driving factors that are there and identify the really striking characteristics on each of the levels we take a look at in order to arrive at a clearer picture in the end. One point I would like to reply to is about the robustness of the correlations between the flexible study modes, which is actually a finding that I found quite interesting and didn't expect initially as well. You were doubting the validity of the data, if I got it right. Actually, I think one has to take a really close look at the survey questions we asked for each of the characteristics we take into account. So the online learning and the part-time status, as well as the correspondence status. And also keep in mind the national specifics that lie behind all of this. I think the formal status of part-time studies really is a more legal kind of characteristic than both of the other flexible study modes. The question we ask really relates to the formality of a part-time status, which doesn't necessarily mean that that there are actual part-time students within the group we see as legal full-time students. So there is some kind of actual divide between actual and legal status, most probably. This is one thing. So let me go through all of your comments. If I see something I would like to respond to immediately. Now, as I said, most of your points are valid and I am aware of them. And you're most certainly right about the topic of social selectivity being something on its own. It's most probably a topic that should have its own kind of report or research. But nevertheless, I think it's important when taking a look at the interplay of flexible study modes, student background, and what it does to and institutions and what it leads to in terms of peer integration, for example. It's really important to take all of this into account in order to arrive at a kind of holistic result. Yeah, I think this is it for now.
Okay, thank you. And I see some questions on. So Alberto, you had a question. I think it's more interesting you ask yourself.
Okay. Yes, actually, I have three comments. The first one is what I put in the chat. Basically, I didn't understand whether in the figure you put of the distance learning by country, you are including also universities that only offer online learning in these countries. And related to this, I didn't get to what extent the distance learning or the flexible learning is a choice of the student or an imposition from the institution? Like maybe in some countries or in some disciplines or in some institutions, students do not have the choice to choose between flexible modes or like in-person learning. So do you know, do you have information about this? And then I have a second comment. I think at a certain point you show the relation between again, distance learning or flexible study modes with PhD and education intensity. I was wondering whether with your data, you can also correlate the distance learning with the quality of the research professors, because I thought that, well, maybe when you have like very high quality research professors, it's better to have in-person learning, no? Maybe because students learn best through interactions with the high quality professors, and they may help more students in progress, like beyond what they could achieve independently. So maybe it's interesting to see whether when you in an institution where there are very high quality professors, if there is a trend of going into this distance learning or maintaining in-person learning. And a very final comment, I'm not, let's say, very aware about this data. How did you link Eurostudent with either? Is like the link is at the institution level or individual? I think it's institution level, right? Thank you.
Thank you for these questions. I'll start with the last one. We actually managed to merge the data from the European Tertiary Education Register to the survey data on individual level. It was implemented by our national research teams in the 25 participating countries, as they have really the best knowledge about how to match the different HEI codes to each other. As you can imagine, each nation has its own kind of coding, the institutions. So there had to be some recoding, but yeah, we were actually quite successful in matching this institutional data to the individual survey data. Now, to answer your first question, yes, we do have institutions in our samples that only offer distance learning. For example, there's a university in Germany, Fernuniversität Hagen, which is for 70,000 students, I think, and these are included in our sample as well, and they only offer distance learning, which is one example. Regarding the free choice of online studies, we can quite answer your question regarding this thing. We not only measured the balance, the individual balance between online and in-person studies, but we also measured the preferred mode of studies, and then matched both characteristics against each other. And one really interesting finding that I didn't expect when designing the questionnaire and everything is that we see that actually the actual study mode matches the preferred or ideal study mode from students' perspective. And this finding also holds true when I differentiate the data for diverse student groups like age group or educational background and dependency on diverse forms of income and so on, which actually is an indicator that higher education systems seem to be able to provide the study modes that are actually wanted or preferred by students to a considerable degree, which still needs to be kept in mind every time is that we only do surveys among students. We don't have data about those who already dropped out or anything like that. So one can also assume that those who don't get the delivery mode or the flexible study mode they wish for have already dropped out, and we don't have data about them. So it's only the survivors, so to say, who are kept in our sample.
Okay.
Yeah, and finally, the correlation between distance learning and the lecturer relationship, or the quality of lecturing, is something that I did have a preliminary look at, but which also needs to be more thoroughly examined. I only had a really in-depth look as far as possible until now regarding the digital studies.
Okay, thank you very much. It's very interesting.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I see also Albert Dietrich who had a couple of questions. Albert, would you like to?
Yeah, I wrote my question into the chat.
Yes, but it's more nice
Okay.
if you ask directly.
Okay. Of course, your correlations are based on data which are available. And the driving factors which you focused on are, of course, very important for creating the future of educational systems. However, also the inhibition factors should be taken into account. For instance, in Austria, there is a good example for the many different factors who are inhibiting to create or to found a digital university in Linz in Upper Austria, which was not successful. This is a very good example. If you read the reports on the attempt to found this digital university, you can notice there are legal arguments, there are financial arguments, and so on, and of all these inhibiting factors.
Thank you for the suggestion. I actually wasn't aware of the example in Linz, but I do know of one or two examples in Germany, which seem, just taking into account the rough information you now provided, seems to be quite different. And this also ties into something I think is a problem in many countries, that legal hurdles really are a problem in many cases. But still, I think, as I at one point in my presentation also said, will not really hinder the students from creating their own kind of flexibility in case legal forms or more formalized ways are not offered. In case there are no digital formats or there are no flexible modes of other kinds, students will simply go or study in a lower intensity and create their own kind of flexibility in case they have to take care of their children or somebody else, or go to a job or something like that. And it will only increase the risk of those people dropping out. So the way to go ahead should be, I think, to make legal hurdles or inhibiting factors as low as possible in order to allow for study success of student groups at risk.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I want to open the floor if there are other questions. Any more questions to Hendrik? One comment I would have, maybe we can discuss shortly, is about the political policy implications of this. On the one hand, you say rightly, if there are problems with children and there are family reasons, there are other reasons, students need flexibility. Now, my issue is flexibility is offered by lower tier so to express, institutions. You get to an online university, you get to a part-time studium, and it's not the same as a full-time university. You run the risk of creating flexibility at a price of marginalization in terms of value of your diploma as given by the employers. So I would say my policy implication is that it would be even more important to find ways of getting flexibility within a normal study rather than to create a sort of ghettos, which might in some cases be the only solution, but might be risky of repeating the same social inequality patterns. Because if we end up having the students who have a family, who have kids, grandmothers, etc., who study partially online, part-time, not moving from home, and the other class is the students who move from home to another university, maybe have a mobility semester elsewhere, etc., we recreate a two-class system within higher education. So I think that's an important topic for study. I don't know what you might want to say.
Kind of a big question, I think. Still, I think, as you said, you are creating two classes, so to say, within higher education. At least it is within, and not one group can study and one is completely left out. But on a broader level, I would say politicians really, especially at the European level, have to ask themselves at what price the social dimension of European higher education really should be pushed forward. And this is exactly because of the reasons you mentioned. I think there's no real way or no simple way out. Either you decide to have a completely inclusive system, higher education system, allowing for everyone to finally arrive at a higher education degree, and there's no real other way from my perspective than to allow for flexible study modes in accomplishing this. Or you decide, okay, social inclusion only goes to a certain point, and then we have to make sure that quality and a more shared higher education experience is really the thing we want.
Yeah, I would like to add the experience we made in countries like Switzerland with apprenticeship, that at the end, I'm not really sure that the labor market outcome of people doing apprenticeship with a good professional diploma outside higher education, I'm not sure it would be worse than getting them an online diploma for somewhere, from some of the place. So I think our task as research is also questioning that the indicators share of a cohort going to higher education is always more is better in terms of social outcomes.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, I think. Nevertheless, I think we always have to keep an eye on the political goals and what the policymakers formulate what they want. And on the other hand, really show what the difficulties on the one hand may be in case one reaches this goal, and on the other hand, to monitor the difficulties in arriving at this goal. And this is the thing, I think.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments? I think you're working on an extremely relevant topic. And I really feel we should push forward the integration with data from the European Higher Education Sector Observatory and Eurostudent, and in perspective, the sister project, Eurograduate, because this might have both important research implications and very important policy implications. And I'm sure this will attract interest of policymakers. We are also working on studying differences of mobility of students by social status with Euro students. So this is something to go in the coming years. With all this said, I think we should just announce the next seminar. I don't know, Rita, whether you can show the slide now.
Not yet.
Okay, but we just mentioned the next seminar. As you know, RISIS seminars are not just higher education. So the next one will be on innovation in rural regions, revealing creativity-led innovation in rural regions by Nicola Cortinovis, Utrecht University. And it will be the 4th of December at 12:30 p.m. 12:30 p.m. should be. As usual, and I think the easiest way, I'll post a link in the chat. And to answer to some questions, we will post online also the slides and the recordings of this seminar. All this said, I would like to thank everybody for your contribution and wish you a nice afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
And many
Bye.
thanks for the great presentation.